pause to introduce you to Professor Omer directly. Her first book is entitled When Peace is Not Enough, How the Israeli Peace Camp Thinks About Religion, Nationalism, and Justice. It is an in-depth case study on religion, conflict, and peace focused on Israel that I found especially inspiring. Specifically, in this text, she develops a concept that she calls a hermeneutic of citizenship that I'm eager to share with you. Professor Omer joined us here in the studio to talk about her early influences growing up in Israel, her situatedness, and her concept of the hermeneutic of citizenship. Let's hear from her now.
My name is Atalia Omer. I am an associate professor at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. I grew up in Jerusalem, in West Jerusalem, to be exact. My grandparents came from Europe, from Poland, from Czechoslovakia. My grandfather was a Zionist. He was a delegate to the Zionist Congress, and this is how he survived, because he became a Zionist. He came to Palestine in the 30s and stayed there. And I'm also the daughter of a father that was a critic of Israeli society. He was a writer and a poet, an author, and he was critical of the kind of narrative that he found being very manipulative narrative about Jewish history and Israeli identity. He was a peace activist, and my first memory in life was being with him when he protested together with many other people, and a protest that became the moment, the birth moment of the Israeli peace camp that is now, in 2017, is significantly diminished. But in any case, that peace demonstration and commitment to justice for Palestinians was very central for my upbringing. Now, all my childhood, I grappled with the question of identity, of Jewish Israeli identity. What did it mean? I left Israel around the time of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister, who was instrumental in the Oslo peace process, and that was a very traumatic moment for me. And I started my higher education. I did all my higher education in the U.S. The first time that I studied Arabic, which is the language of the place where I grew up, the language of Palestinians, was actually in the University of California, Santa Barbara, where I did my bachelor degree in Islamic studies, Islamic and Near Eastern studies. And then I continued to first to complete a master's degree at Harvard Divinity School, and then a PhD at Harvard University. That really, both in both degrees, both contexts, I just chose to examine very deeply the relationship between religion and ideology, religion and construction of political identities, but also constructively about recognizing the selective ways in which claims to identity are articulated, also open up the constructive possibilities for reimagining identities as more inclusive. So in my first book, I look at how Arab Jews who came from Muslim and Arab context, how they embody a different kind of narrative by their very experiences, different narrative than the narrative of European Jews. And of course, the European Jews and Euro-Zionism is trying to assimilate the histories of Arab Jews into a particular understanding of Jewish history. But they're very embodied, the Arab Jews' very embodied experience challenge those narratives, and also offer resources for reimagining, let's say, cohabitation in the context of Israel-Palestine. So the hermeneutic of citizenship is really about ways of thinking and ways in which we can already identify counter-hegemonic experiences, critique, but also ways of imagining alternative possibilities that are peace-promoting. Hermeneutics of citizenship really builds on the understanding that identities are constructed. Now, the fact that identities are constructed doesn't mean that they are not experienced as real and authentic by people. It can help illuminate how the process of selectivity in which certain threads of a tradition or historical memories are lifted and others are downplayed. So, for instance, in the case of political Zionism, as it's embodied in the Israeli state, how Jewish Israeli children are socialized into a particular Israeli identity, is informed by a selective retrieval of certain narratives from the vastness of Jewish history. One such narrative is, of course, the Masada story, that in fact for millennia of Jewish history was completely repressed because it was a disastrous narrative. It's a narrative about suicide, collective suicide, and but within the ethos of Israel, it was lifted with the big slogan of Masada will never happen again, will never fall again, and this slogan really captures the kind of commitments. It captures what it means to be a part of this project of the Jewish Israeli state. Now, hermeneutics of citizenship wants to open it up, really examine and highlight and denaturalize what appears to be natural, denaturalize through employing critique, employing a layer or the method of historicity, really highlighting where power comes in, why certain threads of the tradition were lifted, others were suppressed. For instance, another example would be that for most of Jewish history, masculinity was not about being a heroic warrior or working the land, but rather about studying Torah and being a learned person. That was what Jewish masculinity meant for most of Jewish history in the European context. So the critical angle of the hermeneutics of citizenship really denaturalize what appears to be natural, unsettle understanding, self-understanding. And but this process of critique is not for its own sake. It's in order to open up new resources, constructive resources for reimagining who we are. Because reimagining who we are is key for thinking for the ways in which we can imagine justice. My later work, a book that is based on research with American Jews who are Palestine solidarity activists, need to undergo a process of, and this is a concept that they themselves use, of unlearning the narratives that they received in Jewish day schools, in different synagogues, in summer camps. In fact, one of the major campaigns of American Jews who are anti-occupation in their self-description is really to challenge the kind of socialization that they underwent in the American context, the Zionist socialization, and they are angry at their elders, at the establishment, for not telling them about the occupation. So in order to kind of undergo a process of a profound paradigm shift, some of those critics, the Jewish critics, say, well, first of all, don't do it in my name, don't occupy Palestinians in my name, and also Jewish lives and Palestinian lives and other lives have equal worth. To get to this point, you need to undo a lot of kind of ideological, many layers of ideological discourse, and the role of the academy, the role of scholarship, of critical scholarship, of the tools of critique is very important. And some of the I would say there is a tendency in the field of religion and peace building, as well as religion and development, to think of the question of religion, violence, and religion and violence and religion and peace building only in terms of where religious actors engage in one way or another with the question of acute, direct forms of violence. So part of my approach is to broaden the conception of violence that I operate with, that we operate with, to other forms of violence and how they interact with one another. So it's very important to look at deadly violence, acute violence, but also I always want to look at symbolic, structural, and cultural violence and how those forms of violence interact with acute violence. So this is why I developed this particular methodology of the hermeneutics of citizenship, engaging in critique that highlights how and why and particular interpretations of cultural identity and religious identities, really how religious meanings participates in ideological constructs, but also recognizing that identities are constructed is actually really good news, because it really opens up the possibility of thinking, okay, how can we reimagine identities that will be in ways that will be more conducive to cohabitation and justice.